Cities and Green Climate Activism, Global Influences on Local Policy. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'd like to introduce you to some concepts related to global influences on local municipal activities. And some of the people that I've been talking with are very concerned that climate policies that are being set by cities are not exactly what voters wanted, and they want to know, where are these influences coming from? So I've put together quite a collection of material here. A lot of it's on a timeline, and it's a fairly detailed presentation. So you might want to take a break from time to time, or you might want to get yourself a coffee now. But I'm hoping that it will give you some insights into how various big international, transnational, unelected, unaccountable forces are affecting your municipal policies. So let's have a look at the information that I have to present. Cities are saving the planet by declaring war on citizens, or that's the impression that a lot of people get. Did you really vote for this? And this is a report by Robert Lyman on Ottawa's climate plan. Now, on the good side, the roots of climate change lie in the environmental management issues that we faced some years ago. For example, Los Angeles, in the top image, is in 1955 filled with smog versus 2016. The air looks pretty good. The street looks lovely. It's a whole different world. So there are lots of benefits that came from the original environmental movement. But cities and towns face many challenges. There are high concentrations of people, development and maintenance of all roads in all weather, industrial and agro-sector development, reliable provision of potable water, high energy demand, real estate, community development, reliable provision of natural gas for heating and cooking or electrical power, air pollution issues, public sanitation, public order and safety, waste and sewage management, retail sector development, and of course, tourism and festival events, which are great for spreading the word about your location, but they do introduce another element of randomness to an ordered society, and they put a lot of strain on public resources. So futurists and climate activists offered solutions for cities and opportunities for investors. And I want to focus on this one fellow, Jeremy Rifkin, because his books have really been popularized, and he's also quite proudly claimed that he has been a key consultant for the energy and climate policies of places like Germany. And as you can see, some of the popular books here: The Hydrogen Economy, The Third Industrial Revolution, The Zero Marginal Cost Society, and even Mark Carney, of course, says net zero goal is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. So what is it with cities? Well, cities also have large pension funds for investment in new solutions, large insurance requirements, large populations that can support additional costs of new innovations, large requirements for managing both citizen behavior and the use or disposal of materials, large energy and transportation needs, and the concepts related to the Third Industrial Revolution and smart cities make sense for cities in many ways. For example, smart city analysis can coordinate traffic lights to reduce congestion. The benefits are reduced emissions from idling, reduced ground pollution, more efficient traffic flow. It reduces the risk of road rage, improves citizen appreciation of municipal government. Or transit apps. They provide up-to-date transit info for the public, for the transit users. It helps with workplace efficiency, public mobility, more satisfied citizen customers, public health and safety, so people are not waiting or stranded in cold weather. And on the big picture, efficiencies may be found on overall municipal operations due to smart data analysis or operation. But good ideas can go too far. These apps and other smart city tracking can be misapplied to create a data mining surveillance society, like that proposed by Google for Toronto's Sidewalk Lab, which failed to pass the municipal, provincial, and federal privacy laws. The project was abruptly cancelled in May of 2020 when lockdowns hit. And coincidentally, much of the world became something of a big tech surveillance society with COVID and ArriveCan apps. So here's kind of a corny example of urban data tracking, Super Bowl Sunday flush. You can see start of halftime, end of halftime, end of the Super Bowl. So, city operations can be prepared for these kinds of anomalies. So why are pension funds and insurance companies relevant to this conversation? Well, pension funds must make about a 7% return annually to remain funded. Various global losses like the dot-com bubble, real estate collapse of the 1980s, the crash of 2008 drained the coffers. Remaking society with all new things offered the possibility of the kind of post-World War II economic growth. EVs replacing internal combustion engine vehicles, induction stoves replacing gas or electric stoves, electrification of houses and industry requiring the doubling or tripling of the power grid, non-agricultural food like lab-made or alternative proteins, replacing farmed food. 100% renewable economy would be free and all managed well by AI. That was the theory. So cities, counties, provinces, countries, states issue bonds that need buyers, and without buyers, the economy collapses. So it seemed like a good combination of all these things, what's not to like, and dozens of startups popped up. But let's go back in time for a moment. 1989, Bill McKibben, one of the most influential environmentalist and climate activist people around. What did he see? He's still pushing this. He's like a hippie gone high-tech. He felt that the only possible path to survival was through a fundamental reconsideration of our worldviews, aspirations, and life goals, the creation of a new consciousness that would dramatically reorganize society, ending our addiction to fossil fuels, economic growth, and consumerism. In this pastoral future, free of consumerism or material ambition, Americans would rarely travel, experience the world via the internet, grow much of their own food, power their communities through solar and wind, and divert their wealth to developing countries. Only under these transformational conditions, argued McKibben, would we be able to set a moral example for countries like China to change course, all in the hope that these countries will accept a grand bargain toward a cleaner energy path. So about the same time, ICLEI was formed. This is the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. And again, initially it was environmental issues. And about that same time, as in this article in The Independent, McKinsey and Enron got going. So McKinsey's fingerprints can be found at the scene of some of the most spectacular corporate and financial debacles of recent decades. The energy trading firm Enron was the creation of Jeff Skilling, a proud McKinsey consultant of 21 years. But this wasn't guilt by association. Enron, under Mr. Skilling, was paying McKinsey $10 million a year for advice. McKinsey fully endorsed the dubious accounting methods that caused the company to implode in 2001. And people don't realize today how influential Enron was on the Kyoto Protocol, which was the forerunner to the Paris Agreement. It's worth a read of Enron's Other Secret by Lawrence Solomon from 2009. To magnify the leverage of their political lobbying, Enron also worked with the environmental groups. Between 1994 and 96, the Enron Foundation donated $1 million to the Nature Conservancy and its climate change project, a leading force for global warming reform, while Ken Lay, and other individuals associated with Enron donated $1.5 million to environmental groups seeking international controls on carbon dioxide. So you can see they've been at this for a long time. And a side note, apparently one of Enron's extended funds was making a 25% return, certainly of interest to funds that normally expect or want a 7% return. So Enron was making money in cap and trade on sulfur dioxide from coal plants as various forms of filtration and scrubbers were implemented to reduce the pollution. But that took a shorter time than imagined, and they looked for another way to make money. This is discussed in Let Them Eat Carbon. And so they fell upon the idea of carbon dioxide. And in fact, this article in Harper's Magazine by Mark Shapiro says it best. The carbon market is based on the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. Now, Professor Richard Lindzen from the get-go said that controlling carbon dioxide, is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. So going back to our timeline, about the same time in 1990, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development was set up. This is a group of about 200 major international corporations, but within the group there's about 35,000 in the supply chain corporations. So that's information from an interview I did with William Kay in 2016. And about the same time, in the year 2000, the Carbon Disclosure Project was set up. This is a Rockefeller charitable project. And the purpose of it was that cities and corporations would voluntarily report their carbon footprint to the CDP. The CDP has a big accounting firm like Accenture or PwC to aggregate the responses into ESG investor reports for UNPRI investors. This has created a huge cottage industry related to carbon and GHG reporting that is about to become a monster, with Scope 1, 2, 3 reporting for corporations and climate risk reporting for banks and financial institutions. And you can see now, this is today, that the CDP works closely with all of these municipal-related groups and organizations. And a little bit after that, the C40 Cities was established in 2005 by the Mayor of London, England, Ken Livingstone. And he convened representatives from 18 megacities to forge an agreement on cooperatively reducing climate pollution. And about the same time, the UNPRI was established, and climate change has become their focus. Climate change is the highest priority ESG issue facing investors. The PRI is working to help investors protect portfolios from risks and to expose them to opportunities in the shift to a low-carbon global economy. Now, if we step back a bit, you'll find that in the 1970s, Peter Drucker, the management guru, had foreseen that pension fund socialism would sweep corporate America, that pension funds would become owners of corporations. But at the time, none were woke and none were climate activists. And so we can see the growth of the UNPRI. One of their items says that with 7,000 corporate signatories in 135 countries, it's the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. And some of the founding members of the UNPRI will be familiar. Canada Pension Plan, Caisse de dépôt out of Quebec, that's the provincial pension plan there, BC Investment Management Corp, the Catholic Superannuation Fund. You can go through the whole list on the UNPRI and see. And of course, they operate on these 6 principles. We will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making. We will be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies. We will seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues, la-di-da-di-da. And here in Principle 6, they will have their voluntary signatory members comply or explain. So lots of pressure to comply. And the UNPRI is an enormous financial powerhouse. The collective assets under management, represented by 3,826 PRI signatories, which 3,404 investors and 422 service providers, increased by 17% over the period from 103.4 trillion to just over 121 trillion as of March 31st, 2021. Now, for context, Canada's GDP was $2.1 trillion US dollars in 2022. And they've also expanded their base. While our asset owner base was previously dominated by public pension funds, it has diversified in recent years as recruitment of endowments, foundations, corporate pensions, and insurance companies has grown. The latter group, made up of 132 signatories, now represents 60% of assets under management. So let's think about how big is $1 trillion. Well, if we look at this fellow, he's got a pile of $100 bills in packets of 10,000 at his feet. And if we extrapolate that, here is $1 trillion. So the value of the assets under management, the things that they own, is $121 trillion. And their fiduciary guru is Al Gore. So by creating this organization, fiduciaries went from being a prudent man to being ESG activist social engineers. Now, about this same time, curiously, Friends of Science Society in 2005 squared off against Stephen Guilbeault of Greenpeace in Senate hearings on the Kyoto Protocols, the forerunner to the Paris Agreement. And this is what our expert witness said. He was there with Chuck Simpson, one of our co-founders. He said, "The field of climate science is vast, and I should emphasize rapidly evolving. Many things we thought we knew about the climate system just a few years ago are now proving to be highly uncertain or quite mistaken. It's no exaggeration to say that in the 8 years since the Kyoto Protocol was introduced, there has been a revolution in climate science. This is not surprising given that the industrial world has spent around $30 billion on climate research over that period." This is the key point. If back in the mid-1990s we knew what we know about climate change today, there would be no Kyoto Protocol because it would have been considered unnecessary. And about the same time, Dr. Sally Baliunas and Dr. Tim Patterson challenged the Pembina Institute's narrative on climate change in 2002 in the PEG. This is a PEG is professional journal. That's the Journal of the Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. And if you look at the ClimateGate emails, they show that senior IPCC scientists went out of their way to destroy the reputations and careers of Friends of Science societies, scientific advisors, and their peer-reviewed publications. So climate censorship of dissenting views began decades ago. Thus, poor public policy on climate and energy has flourished, driven by big green philanthropists keen to create global carbon markets and cash in on subsidies. Dr. Baliunas and Friends of Science Society hold the view that the sun is the main driver of climate change, not you, not CO2. In 2008, Climate Catastrophe Cancelled. Friends of Science Society's documentary, Climate Catastrophe Cancelled, was cancelled. When we distributed DVD copies to school, they were thrown in the garbage. Where once our annual speakers were interviewed by newspapers, radio stations, and TV newscasts, we suddenly became locked out of all media. And again, about this time in the early 2000s, this book was published by Adam Harms, Unseen Power: How Mutual Funds Threaten the Political and Economic Wealth of Nations. So Harms concluded that the explosion of individuals investing their money in financial markets through RRSPs and mutual funds has created an unsettling catch-22 for the middle-class portfolio, as the same investors or the same policies that benefit individuals in their role as investors are also hurting them in their roles as workers and citizens. Harms finds that mutual funds have been at the heart of the major financial crises of the past decade, and he shows how institutional investors have also created the conditions for large-scale corporate restructuring and mass liquidation of jobs. Again, in the 2000s, ClimateWorks was formed. It's a huge foundation. It's a collection of over a dozen huge philanthropies pushing climate change. They came up with this plan, which is basically the same plan that Enron used by paying environmental groups to advocate for what you want. So they become your proxies. And ClimateWorks has been putting out about $600 million a year to these various groups, many of which are charities. So they double up that money quite easily. And they've been promoting renewable energy. They've been opposing fossil fuel industry. They've been promoting renewable energy communication. They've been opposing natural gas and fracking. They've been pushing climate change-related communication in the media, promoting sustainable transportation and clean vehicles, promoting sustainable agriculture, land use, protect ecosystems, promoting climate mitigation, etc., etc. But the interesting thing here, this is an excerpt from Matthew Nisbet's work, and he's been tracking them for a long time. He said leading the report was the recommendation that tempering climate change required a strong cap and trade policy in the United States and the European Union, and a binding international agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. The report predicted that the passage of cap and trade legislation would prompt a sea change that washes over the entire global economy. The report included little to no discussion of the role of government and philanthropy in directly sponsoring the creation of new technologies, and the report is additionally notable for the absence of any meaningful discussion of social, political, or cultural dimensions of the challenge. So global markets became skewed. And back in the 1950s, the Ricci Commission found that big philanthropies and foundations had too much power. And today, the House Judiciary Committee in the United States has found that there's a climate cartel. And they state that the climate cartel has declared war on the American way of life. The climate cartel is waging a global world war for net zero against disfavored American companies, including those in the fossil fuel, aviation, and farming industries that allow Americans to drive, fly, and eat. So institutional investors used to look for a good return on investment. The UNPRI turned signatories into activist investors. Now, things took off in sustainable clean tech investing initially, but by 2013, there was trouble. This is Joseph Deere speaking with the Wall Street Journal in 2013 about the failure of their clean tech fund. He said, "Just because it's a good idea doesn't make it a good investment. This has been a noble way to lose money." And it was actually big trouble because instead of a J curve, clean tech investing has got an L curve for lose. So Joseph Deere is the Chief Investment Officer of California Public Employees Retirement System, the big public pension fund. According to Mr. Deere, a CalPERS fund devoted to clean energy and technology, which started in 2007 with $460 million, has had an annualized return of minus 9.7% to date. That was to 2013. So what he said about the future is what's going to make these markets really take off is if the price of alternative energy drops below the price of a carbon energy equivalent. You'll no longer need incentives or anything. And if that's not going to happen, somebody has to step in and either raise the price of carbon or lower the cost of the alternatives. So let's think about that for a minute. We have this ever-rising carbon tax, and it seems that that would be why. And we also have people claiming all the time that wind and solar are the cheapest form of energy out there when they're actually not, when you do the full analysis of it. So he was kind of being, I guess, predicting the future, at least of public policy. And then there was more trouble. In 2013, the science contradicted the climate catastrophe narrative because there had been a lack of warming. There was no statistically significant global warming since before the Kyoto Protocol. So that was like the past 15 years, which kind of, despite a rise in carbon dioxide concentration and emissions. And on January 16th, 2014, Dr. Judith Curry testified to the U.S. Senate that carbon dioxide is not a control knob that can fine-tune climate. So it sounded like the whole climate catastrophe thing should have been over then, but a miracle happened for climate catastrophists in 2014. These two green billionaires got together with a bunch of environmentalists and wrote this report, Risky Business, which then proliferated throughout the financial community. At the same time in 2014, the UNPRI came up with the Montreal Pledge, getting their signatories to be climate activists. The PRI is continuing to coordinate a working group of 22 investors, engaging companies in Australia, Canada, and the US on their climate-related lobbying activities, in particularly where the company's public position is inconsistent with the positions of trade associations it belongs to. We are working with the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change on their parallel initiative in Europe. The statement and working group also bolster existing efforts underway, including the UN's Caring for Climate program on responsible corporate engagement in climate policy. And so their intention was to move laggards like Canada along. About that time, we wrote these two reports because the pension fund community had come up with a report saying that climate denial was not an option anymore. So we challenged this claim in these two reports. And in 2015, Mark Carney's speech to Lloyd's of London referenced the Risky Business Report, and he also said the desirability of restricting climate change to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels leads to the notion of a carbon budget, an assessment of the amount of emissions the world can afford. Just to pause for a moment, we've recently heard that in the press, this notion of perhaps we need a national carbon budget in Canada. If you think about what that ultimately means, it means that everyone will have a personal carbon ration. So that's the road that leads to. But I digress. So somebody did a fact check of Mark Carney's catastrophic climate claims. His name is Steve Kopitz. He's an energy analyst in the States, and he said, as an analyst, I find Mr. Carney's speech is truly dismaying. For the governor of the bank to claim that climate change is leading to rapidly rising insurance claims is, at best, a critical failure of analysis. So what happened is that Risky Business relied on RCP 8.5, Representative Concentration Pathway, R 8.5. This is a computer scenario that was made for research purposes only, but has since become some kind of a policy pathway. It shouldn't be, but that's how it's being used. The problem is, this business as usual case is implausible. And you can see here, it looks pretty scary, doesn't it? That line going up. But if we take RCP 8.5 out of the picture, it's not so scary. There's no climate emergency. But unfortunately, now banks, financial institutions, the federal government, and climate data centers claim RCP 8.5 is business as usual. And why is RCP 8.5 implausible? Well, these scenarios were strictly designed for research, not as pathways for decarbonization. Whereas the United Nations projects world population to be about 9 billion by 2100, the RCP 8.5 scenario assumed that it could be between 12 and 15 billion, which is 3 to 6 billion more people than demographically possible. Under RCP 8.5, world crude oil production in 2100 would have to be about 4 times that of 2015. Oil companies would have to find and produce roughly 4 trillion barrels of crude oil between now and 2100. That's about twice the level of proven crude oil reserves now, plus the current estimate of technically recoverable resource potential. So that's impossible. And several academic papers have explored whether there are even enough coal reserves in the world to satisfy the demands assumed in RCP 8.5. So you can see it's quite implausible. And Robert Lyman has written this report, plain language report, that explains these things. It's on our blog. So RCP 8.5 is implausible. It's not business as usual. And yet here's the Prairie Climate Center Climate Atlas saying high carbon RCP 8.5. This is the business as usual scenario. It's not. Prairie Climate Center is at the University of Winnipeg, and it uses the RCP 8.5. Meanwhile, the UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, abandoned its use as of COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. So Climate Atlas which is part of the Prairie Climate Center, has come up with all of these forward-looking assessments of climate change in Canadian cities. And they say that they use 24 downscaled climate models, and they use a low-carbon and a high-carbon RCP 8.5 scenario and 2 future time periods, 2021 and 2050 and 2051 to 2080. So if you can see that far into the future, I'll be happy to be around to see what your predictions come to. But really, downscaling climate models doesn't work. And just to give you a quick idea of what's a climate model, it's a virtual grid that's constructed, and then within it, various algorithms are set up to replicate the various processes of heat and moisture transfer, etc., etc. But global climate models that cover the globe, the grid cells are often larger than 100 kilometers. So if we just take a look at Alberta and Calgary, you can see how difficult it would be to downscale that kind of a model to Calgary. And the simple example for us ordinary folks, I think, would be, think of trying to downscale a cake recipe to make just one cupcake. That doesn't work. And not to mention, in Alberta particularly, this part of the province, well, even more of it, really is hit by the Chinook effect, meaning that it's very, very unpredictable. Nonetheless, Climate Atlas has a City of Calgary forecast, and you can see over here it's a high carbon climate change projection, and so they figure it's going to be like almost 10 degrees hotter, that the typical coldest day will be only minus 20 instead of minus 33, that there'll be 55 days that are be plus 30 when there's really only 5, that there'll be almost double the amount of precipitation, that the summer in spring, and that in summer the precipitation will be 333 millimeters instead of 200. The number of below zero days per year will be only 169, and the frost-free days will go up to 192. I don't know. Do you think that's plausible? But unfortunately, to get infrastructure funding, Canada funding for climate risk assessments for cities, the Climate Lens uses RCP 8.5. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions uses RCP 8.5. Bank of Canada uses RCP 8.5. And so if you want to, build a bridge or something, then you're going to have to use this implausible scenario, RCP 8.5, if you want to get funding from the federal government and you're a city. Now, if we go back to 2015 and the Paris Agreement, RCP 8.5 leads to bad policy decisions because Yvo Debord, who was then the executive secretary, said the only way that a 2015 agreement can achieve a 2-degree goal is to shut down the whole global economy. Now, this whole idea of this 2-degree goal is ludicrous because according to this book and these authors, although the 2-degree and 1.5 degrees C targets are political goals and not scientific ones, they're based on an ambiguous and somewhat contentious pre-industrial baseline. They were inspired by the IPCC's work. So they are political and not scientific goals. And the Paris Agreement is entirely voluntary. But Canada enshrined net zero targets, that was in Bill C-12, and the Paris Agreement into law. So you may say, well, that's all very nice, Michelle, but I don't get what you're talking about. How does it affect me in my city or me here in the province of Alberta. Here's an example. September 8th, 2015. Here's how these activist investors are skewing markets. NEI Investments sent this letter to then Premier Notley. And they open with this line. It's quite the humdinger. The undersigned institutions, of which there were 120, representing over $4.6 trillion Canadian in assets under management, invest in companies that operate in Alberta. We are writing today to support the government of Alberta in its stated intention to update and strengthen its climate policy, and strongly agree that this should be a priority area. So, Alberta early coal phase-out. NEI Investments thought that was great, and they even think that they were instrumental in making that happen. They wrote this paper. You can find it. We have it posted on our website as well. The End of the World as We Know It, Transitioning to a Low-Carbon Energy System. So, Alberta phased out 6,000 megawatts of coal, and now we face blackouts. Meanwhile, in the world, from 2015 through 2024, globally, over 600,000 megawatts of coal-fired power were added. Of that, about 300,000 were retired, but nonetheless, a huge amount of coal was added. And you can see here, China is the leader in the consumption of coal, and here's Canada. So I don't think that we saved the planet. And over here you can see by emissions, here's China, here's Canada. And curiously, Alberta, a sub-sovereign government, reported to the UNPRI on the Climate Change Policy Plan, on its progress and investor feedback. This is now gone from the website, by the way. In 2016, a consulting firm called Arup issued Deadline 2020 for C40 cities. Their objective is that by 2030, everyone will have a 2.9-ton carbon dioxide equivalent carbon footprint. So that's a carbon ration. This was titled Deadline 2020. And you can recall what happened in 2020. The world economy shut down. Likewise, in 2020, this book was published. This is by the former mayor of Toronto. Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. So a lot of how-to guides are in here. Now, you see, you and urban planners don't see the same thing in a vehicle. This is an SUV. It's one of the more popular forms of vehicles in Canada. Canadians love SUVs. They accounted for over 50% of new vehicle sales. So when you look at this, if you're a driver, you see freedom, convenience, and choice. But if you're an urban planner, you see that it's too big, too individual, antisocial. It's an emitter, encourages short trips and overconsumption, needs a road, needs parking, needs a gas station, needs gas, needs road maintenance, needs snow clearing, needs police cruisers. Police cruisers need gas and parking. Police cruisers emit. SUVs cause accidents. Needs an ambulance. Needs a hospital. It's unhealthy. You're sitting, you're not walking. Traffic congestion. So they see this as just a huge problem for a city, whereas you see it as part of your daily life. Okay, so how does that affect things? Well, now we come back to the UNPRI. ESG considerations in Canadian provincial and municipal bonds. Take a closer look at the cover. This does not look like a vibrant city to me. This looks like they are filled with climate ideology. People will be sitting by a stream, riding their bike. Doesn't look like anybody's working, and everything will be powered by wind, perhaps some sun as well. So the UNPRI shares this information with its signatories. This is about the outstanding debt securities of Canadian provinces and territories. This is the municipal debt securities of Canadian cities by province. And this is tables showing the differences between U.S. municipal and Canadian provincial and municipal bond markets. So you can see in the Canadian side that the proportion of ownership might be 20 to 25%. So the proportion of bond ownership by foreign and domestic investors, the climate influence may be significant if the investors are based in Europe, because of course they've been on that net zero type of track for many years before us. In the same document, they have a table showing the emissions by province and per capita. Of course, we're the bad boys here in Alberta, running the engine of the Canadian economy. And they also show the aging population. Now, why is this relevant? Well, think about all these comments about net zero 2030 and net zero 2050. Maybe they're not related to climate. In 2030, the youngest baby boomers will have reached retirement. By 2050, the baby boomer generation will have passed on. So who will support the aging population? This is a very interesting book. The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. And this is an excerpt from some work of this fellow's. Since embarking on its Climate Action Plan 2050 in 2016, Germany, the largest economy in Europe, has gone from the growth engine of the EU bloc to the sick man of Europe. Climate-driven energy policy has led to a downward spiral of deindustrialization and degrowth. And you can see also in this graph, working age population projections. And who is Germany's advisor? Well, this fellow. Now, going back to the Enron funding environmental groups, in Canada we have a really serious issue with the major environmental groups. These are excerpts of reports that we wrote, that Robert Lyman wrote in 2019. And just to summarize what's going on, the revenues received by the environmental non-governmental organizations, ENGOs, and their enviro law counterparts over the period was over 18 times the revenues received by all federal political parties, and over 27 times the revenues received by market-oriented institutes. That would be like Fraser Institute, Frontier Center, etc. Both Ducks Unlimited Canada and the Nature Conservancy Canada annually receive higher revenues than all the major federal political parties. A large portion of the funding to these organizations is from the federal government. The revenue received by the Tides organization, now known as Make Way, by the Tides organization alone, is more than the combined revenues of Canada's two largest federal political parties, the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party, over the period of 2000 to 2018. The David Suzuki Foundation's average annual revenues exceed the annual revenues of the federal New Democratic Party, and 8 ENGOs have annual revenues that exceed those of the governing Liberal Party of Canada. So now you can see why they choose to all be on the climate bandwagon. But that's costing you a fortune. And Robert Lyman has recently done these reports. What are climate policies costing Canada? Turning taxpayers into risk takers, burdensome ideology, and at last, a cost-benefit analysis. So just to give you a few key points, what is climate policy costing us? The total federal and provincial expenditures on climate measures Over the period of 2020 to 2030, as listed by Carbon Policy Tracker, are 476 billion, or 11,900 per resident of Canada. This equates to roughly $28,000 per household, an average of $2,800 per household per year. But that's just what's been announced to date. There remain 5 more fiscal years before 2030, during which governments may add more initiatives. And how about contracts for differences? Well, in one example, the math works out to be the equivalent of a $1,000 167.58 carbon tax per ton. That's absurd, but it's hidden from you, the consumer, the taxpayer, and you'll never see a rebate on that. And how about reaching net zero? So, the net zero challenge ranges between 2 trillion and 5.2 trillion. That's almost an unimaginable amount of money. So 2 trillion is $50,000 for every one of Canada's 40 million residents now, or 118,000 for every household. 5.2 trillion is 130,000 for every resident, or 306,000 for every household. Averaged over 27 years, 2 trillion would cost every one of today's residents about $1,850 per year. Averaged over 27 years, 5.2 trillion would cost every one of today's residents $4,815 per year. So, axing the carbon tax is a good idea, but that's just going to be the start. And the question is, will your sacrifice save the planet? There are some people who may say, I'm very concerned. I want a good future for my children, my grandchildren. What if there is global boiling? Well, let's look at the math. As Canada is responsible for only 1.5%, as Canada is responsible for only 1.5% of global GHG emissions, the federal objective to reduce emissions by 40% would reduce global emissions by 0.6%, some or all of which will be offset by increased emissions elsewhere, like China has no mandate to reduce emissions. If Canada achieved the intended emissions reduction and maintained that reduction in future, the global average temperature would be reduced by 0.007 degrees Celsius, or 7/1000ths of a degree Celsius as of 2100, compared to a case in which Canada does nothing. Doesn't sound like a good cost-benefit arrangement to me. And here's something you probably are not aware of: the cost of climate compliance. We pay $69,000 for every EV. I know that sounds absurd, but you can go through the article that one of our professional engineers did and see the analysis. And there's a very similar analysis out of the United States as well. So basically, that's not just the $4,000 or $5,000, maybe $8,000 in purchasing subsidies and incentives. That goes through the whole chain of developing, selling, and manufacturing these EVs. So how can we continue? I don't think that's sustainable. In fact, net zero is mission impossible. So this graph is from an analysis that one of our directors did. It's on our blog, and we also did a video explainer. So we looked at the Canada Energy Regulator reports, and we also looked at a report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And the only way that we can reach net zero is through degrowth, deindustrialization, deprivation, and poverty for everyone. But fortunately, we won't end up going there because it turns out there's no material supply chain that exists for net zero. So this is an analysis that was done by a mining engineer and professor named Simon Michaud. And he said that he'd been to many boardroom meetings where everyone was quite enthusiastic about net zero and how quick we're going to get there and how easy it would be and how cheap. And yet he never heard anyone talking about the material supply chain. So that means, if you're going to make an EV, you need lithium for the battery, you need all kinds of special metals and mined materials, and you need lots of energy as well to mine them and then to manufacture. So he thought, well, I haven't heard anyone talk about this. Why don't I just do my own analysis? So he took the present levels in 2019 of global metal production and just did an assessment as to how many years it would take to mine the equivalent amount of metal required to produce one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels. So it would take 189 years to mine enough copper and 400 years to mine enough nickel and 9,900 years to mine enough lithium. Well, you get what I mean. It's just not going to happen. It takes about 16 years just to get one mine up and running. And yet, out in the world of climate ideology, the World Bank is saying, according to the IEA, the International Energy Agency, the equivalent of the entire length of the global grid network needs to be replaced or doubled by 2040 to meet energy and climate goals. So that's not going to happen, largely because of this. So there's actually no transition in progress. The latest International Energy Agency World Energy Investment Report shows there's no transition in progress over the past 9 years since the Paris Agreement. Over the period of 2015 to 2024, the countries of the world invested $25.4 trillion on energy, $11.1 trillion on fossil fuels, $14.3 trillion on all non-fossil fuel energy sources, which they call clean energy, and $4.9 trillion on renewable energy like wind, solar, and biomass. And yet, fossil fuels continue to supply 81% of global primary energy demand, and renewable energy supplies only 7% of global primary energy demand. And most of that 7%, is met by biomass. So despite the efforts of many governments to dampen investment in fossil fuels, in 2024, it totaled $1,116 billion, slightly below what it was in 2016, $1,145 billion US. In summary, climate and energy-related public policy is being driven by climate ideologues, famous futurists who are not engineers, and thus lack the technical skill to evaluate net zero dreams or material needs. The implausible RCP 8.5 is deeply embedded in finance, climate modeling, climate policy, and municipal infrastructure planning. The unelected, unaccountable transnational organizations like the UNPRI, plus the networked relationships with CDP, ICLEI, C40 cities, and ENGOs, are skewing public policies to benefit green cronies, not you, the taxpayer. Pension funds and institutional investors have become activists, skewing public policy outside the democratic framework. They are aided or fronted by tax-subsidized environmental charities, ENGOs, who agitate for policies that the big investors want, as if coming from a grassroots demand. Cities with their large pension funds, insurance needs, large populations, and climate groupthink are making investment decisions that may be a form of self-dealing. None of these climate plans are leading to a global energy transition. Net zero 2030 and 2050 are intricately related to the transition of the baby boomer generation. The loss of boomers will decimate the skilled workforce as they retire, and they will also stop contributing to RRSPs and retirement funds. They will be withdrawing funds. They will have more health care and socioeconomic needs. Net zero targets mean degrowth, deindustrialization, and energy deprivation for all but the lucky green crony capitalists. Meanwhile, climate will continue to change as it has always done. So, if that's been useful information, may I invite you to join us in our 22-year battle for common sense and evidence-based climate and energy policy. You can see on our website that we've got lots of climate science information. We've got a very good climate essay, very scientific. We've got a plain language website that's bilingual. We've got a big library of materials. You can join us, become a member, and get our bi-weekly newsletters, which are Cli-Sci and Extracts. Cli-Sci is a newsletter that summarizes the most recent academic climate science papers, energy-related papers, and Extracts is more on the political activities related to groups like the IPCC, the COP conferences, and the implications of such policies. They're both put together by our volunteer directors, and our members really enjoy them because it's news that you just don't get out there in the mainstream media. And our people have been following this material for years. They've read all the big IPCC reports, so they're very good at calling out the ENGOs and activists who make claims that simply aren't supported by the true scientific evidence. Because the IPCC reports themselves, the real reports, are not so catastrophic. It's the media headlines and the summaries for policymakers that are very politicized documents that are the ones that are touted most often in the press. So I hope that you can consider joining us, or maybe you'd like to donate. That would be helpful. We're a very small organization. We offer all of our information to the public for free, and we hope that you will share it with your friends, family, business colleagues, and whoever you think needs to know about what we've ferreted out and put together in a compilation like this. So thanks very much for listening to this presentation. We really appreciate your support. Please like, subscribe, comment down below. Please share our material online on your social media. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.